The most visible representations of the Roman Empire in Paul's day were the tens of thousands of Roman legionnaires that were scattered across the empire from Scotland all the way to Asia. These representatives were the Roman legionnaires, the soldiers. And what marked them as unique is that in all the empire, they were the ones that pledged their dying loyalty to the emperor. I'd like you to think about that as I read to you a similar passage to their oath to the emperor that the Apostle Paul wrote to us. He said this in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. This, Romans 12 tells us, is God's call to us to be His personal representatives. And as His personal representatives, we are to be living sacrifices. I'd like to read to you the lesson that I wrote down from the oath that all the legionnaires took. It's called Sacramentum. And Sacramentum, later on in church history, became the description the church used, sacraments, of communion, of the Lord's table, of that very special meal we have with Christ. It was, in Catholic doctrine, a dispensation of grace to the people through taking the sacraments, but that's not what the early church thought of. Let me read to you what the early church thought of, because Roman soldiers of Caesar's legions were the most powerful institution of the first century. And these soldiers represented personally the emperor. Why did he put so much trust in them? Because they took an oath. Bound together with a life or death allegiance, they were invincible. All Roman legionnaires would come and stand before the emperor, and on their induction, they would look up at him, and the centurion, the leader of the century, of the 100, would declare the oath to the emperor, and then one by one, each of them that were lined up would say, "The same for me." And they would personally pledge their allegiance to the emperor. Let me read to you what that pledge was, because it's so fascinating. They pledged to obey the commands of the general, to serve him to the best of their ability at all times, to always follow the written words of the council, that was the Roman guide for imperial warfare, and never leave the gathered regiment and flee in any battle, and finally, that they would hold the emperor's well-being as most important to them, and that he would be held dearer than their own life or even their family. That was the oath of the Roman legions. Now think about what we declare as followers of Jesus Christ. We declare that we will obey Jesus. That's part of, we learn even as a child, trust and obey. There's no other way to live the Christian life. We want to serve Him. Just as they serve the emperor to the best of their ability, our desire is to serve Christ. Thirdly, just as they would always follow the written words of the council, the imperial guide to warfare, we say that His words are most important to us, and that we will live not by bread alone, but by every word of God. We will listen to His voice. In fact, when we read the scriptures, we're listening to the voice of Jesus. Just as when the Roman legionnaires read the imperial warfare guide, they were listening to the emperor. They would never leave the gathered regiment, the Roman soldiers said. We say, I will follow you. In fact, what was Jesus' two-word call to His disciples that He repeated over and over, even to the end of His ministry? Follow me. Never leave the regiment, the Roman soldiers. Never stop following Christ, us as His disciples. They held the emperor's well-being more important than their own. We are to love Jesus. We love Him more than ourselves, more than life, more than anything else. In fact, that's the great deterrent to sin, that we love Jesus more than ourselves, our sinful desires, anything that would allure us from the world. And finally, that the Roman emperor was to be held dearer to them than themselves or their family. We who follow Christ are willing to sacrifice. Do you remember what Paul said in Romans 12? I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living what? Sacrifice. We've come to a time in Christendom where believers, instead of thinking of sacrifice, are thinking of what's in it for me. They find churches based on the youth program for their kids or the fellowship for them and the activities, rather than coming to Christ to sacrifice for him. Well, the Roman legionnaires, after they stood before the emperor and the centurion repeated the oath, they would say the same for me. And so for us as believers, as the Roman legionnaires pledge their allegiance to the emperor, every time we gather for communion, we say, I am one who presents my body, Romans 12:1, as a living sacrifice. I will love and serve and follow and obey and sacrifice for him.